Two women in matching volunteer vests stood by the coffee urn, and the taller one had her hand half raised to her mouth like she was trying to keep the words in and losing. "He's not even trying to stop them," she said. "Why would he be arrested and not say one word in his own defense?" The shorter one answered. Not really a question, more a fact she was setting down between them like a plate. Neither of them moved from the urn. Neither of them looked away either. Out by the flagpole, Corporal Noah Rutherford had a set of cuffs closed around the wrists of an old man in a canvas coat, and the run sheet tucked under her arm already carried his description in block letters someone had printed that morning. Unverified, tattoo claim, SF style mark, no record on file. She hadn't written those words herself. She only had to enforce them. "Free lunch," the taller volunteer said, shaking her head slowly, like the shaking might dislodge some more charitable read on the scene. "That's what I heard. Somebody said he shows up, flashes ink on his forearm, and word gets around he's special forces so nobody questions him at the buffet line. That's a old man's trick if I ever heard one. If you've ever watched someone stay quiet while they were wrongly accused, you already know the weight Cyrus Hobbs was carrying into that gate, and you know it isn't the weight of guilt. It has a different shape altogether. Guilt makes a man argue. This was something closer to a man setting down a bag he had carried so long that his shoulder had stopped complaining about it, because complaining does no good on a bag you intend to keep carrying regardless. He stood a full head shorter than Rutherford, coat buttoned to the throat though the morning had already burned off its chill, and when the cuffs closed he only exhaled once, long and even, the way a man breathes when he's decided the next several minutes are not going to be about him. "Sir, you understand you're being detained pending verification," Rutherford said, and it came out clean, procedural, the sentence of someone who had practiced saying hard things in a level voice and was proud, quietly, of how level it had gotten. "I understand," Cyrus said. 2 words, no more offered. The ceremony crowd was still arriving in 2s and 3s past the gate, folding chairs under their arms, the color guard rehearsing its turn near the flagpole with the particular seriousness of young men who take the folding of a flag as seriously as its raising. A few heads swiveled toward the handcuffs. A boy of maybe 9 tugged his mother's sleeve, and she pulled him along without looking, the practiced motion of a parent shielding a child from a spectacle she assumed was shameful rather than the reverse. The taller volunteer set her coffee down, cooling forgotten, because something about the old man's stillness had started to needle at her in a way the joke about free lunch could no longer cover. "He doesn't look like he's faking anything," she said, quieter now, mostly to herself. Her friend didn't answer. She was watching the run sheet and the felt-tip checkmark going down beside a name nobody at that coffee urn yet knew to read as Hobbs, Cyrus, and beneath it, in Rutherford's own careful hand, the word "unconfirmed," underlined once, as if underlining a mistake might keep it from spreading. Cyrus Hobbs had worn the same coat to this ceremony for going on 9 years, canvas gone the color of a creek bed in low water, one elbow patched with a scrap of duck cloth that didn't quite match the weave around it, because he had done the patching himself, at his own kitchen table, with a needle that was not made for leather and thread that was. The collar of the shirt beneath it was always buttoned to the throat regardless of the weather, and his left shoulder sat a half-inch lower than his right and simply did not rise past the height of his own chest, so that when he wanted to point at something across a room he turned his whole body toward it instead, a slow, full pivot, like a gate swinging on a hinge that had learned exactly how far it was permitted to open. He did not explain the shoulder. Nobody who mattered to him had ever asked him to. Every Tuesday evening, in the kitchen of the house he and Twyla had kept for most of their 56 years married, he took down a leather sheath from a shelf above the stove, tooled by his own hand decades back, stamped underneath with a unit numeral that had not meant anything to a living unit in a long time, and he oiled it. There was no knife in it. Hadn't been since 1969. He worked the oil into the leather anyway, thumb over thumb, the way you'd tend a wound that had long since closed but that you still checked out of some old private obligation. Twyla set 2 cups of coffee down without being asked, one for him and one for herself, and sat across the table while he worked, saying nothing either, because 56 years teaches 2 people exactly how much silence a Tuesday evening can hold before it needs a word in it. "You'll be late again this year," she said, "this particular Tuesday. Not unkindly, Just an observation offered the way you'd mention weather. I go when I go, he said, working the rag into the seam along the sheath's edge. Once a year, on the date of the Heritage Room's rededication ceremony, Cyrus drove the 40 minutes to the armory at Kestrel Crossing alone, walked the small collection of glass cases lining the west wall of the Veterans Room, and left again before the reception ever started. He never signed the guest book by the door. The book sat on a little podium with a pen chained to it, inviting names, and every year for going on 9 years his name had not gone in it. And every year the volunteer at the podium assumed, reasonably enough, that he'd simply forgotten, or didn't care to. Neither was true. He read every case front to back, the citations and the folded flags and the black and white photographs of boys who had not lived long enough to become anything else. And at the far end of the room, in a case near the door, there had been for years now a small brass placard reading Donor Records, 1969, under review, in front of an empty shelf where nothing had sat since before most of the young men working the gate that day had been born. He looked at that empty shelf every year, the way another man might look at a grave with no stone on it yet. This year, he had barely gotten past the flagpole. Corporal Rutherford's run sheet had come off the printer that morning with 41 names cleared and 6 flagged, and Cyrus Hobbs's had been the 4th. She checked his identification first, driver's license, current, unremarkable, a mill race Ford address that matched nothing suspicious at all, and still she held the run sheet out in front of her like a shield. Per the run sheet, sir, I need you to confirm the nature of that mark on your forearm, she said, nodding at the pale ink just visible past his rolled cuff, a mark none of the men working the gate had ever been trained to recognize because it belonged to no unit any training manual listed. It's old, Cyrus said, older than you. That's not confirmation, sir. No, he agreed. It isn't. She asked him to hold still while a second MP photographed the mark for the flagged person's file, camera flash catching the raised, faded lines of it, a shape more like a river forking than any insignia, and a small crowd had begun gathering the way crowds gather around any uniform standing close to trouble, curious and careful in equal measure. Sir, claiming an unverified Special Forces marking at a federal ceremony is a citable offense, Rutherford said next, reciting from something she had clearly rehearsed without ever expecting to use it, and a ripple went through the onlookers, someone repeating the word citable to someone else, like it was the most interesting word he'd heard all week. I haven't claimed a thing, Cyrus said. You're wearing it, sir. I've worn it 55 years. Didn't ask your permission then either. It wasn't defiance. It came out of him flat and unhurried, the way a man states a fact about weather he has long since stopped being surprised by, and Rutherford, hearing it, felt something under her own certainty shift half a degree, though she could not yet have said which way. I'm going to have to write this up formally, she said, and there was the faintest catch now beneath the procedure in her voice, though she covered it fast, snapping the citation pad open against her palm. Write what you need to, Cyrus said, and held his wrists out level before she'd even asked, which unsettled her more than any protest would have. The holding room off the armory's side hall smelled of old radiator dust and coffee left too long on a burner, and it was here that young MP Austin Purdy, barely 3 years into his enlistment and not yet 3 hours into believing he understood his job, found himself alone with the old man and a discomfort he hadn't expected to feel. Cyrus sat with his cuffed hands resting easy in his lap, back straight, watching the room the way another man might watch weather roll in over a field he'd worked his whole life, unbothered, attentive, waiting on something specific. You're not going to ask for a lawyer, Purdy said. It wasn't quite a question. Don't need one yet. Most folks in your seat would be asking for one already. Most folks in my seat haven't sat in worse ones, Cyrus said, and let that be the whole of it. Purdy chewed on that a while, pacing a slow track between the door and the file cabinet, and something about the old man's stillness kept snagging at him, the way a nail catches a sleeve without tearing it yet. If the man was lying, Purdy reasoned, he ought to be sweating it, working an angle, testing which story might land. Instead, Cyrus sat like a man in a waiting room outside a doctor's office, patient with a diagnosis he already privately suspected. Purdy went looking for something to do with his unease and found it in the corner, in a low steel cabinet marked Heritage Room, Donor Records, Archived, its drawers stiff with disuse. He hauled out the old intake ledger for 1969, a canvas-bound book gone soft at the corners, the kind of ledger nobody had digitized because nobody had thought, 14 years back, that anybody would ever need to. "If that mark's tied to a real unit numeral," Purdy said, half to himself, half to the room, "it'll be logged somewhere in here. Intake stamp, unit code, something." He ran his thumb down the entries for that year, names in fading typewriter ink, until he reached the range of pages where the numeral on Cyrus's forearm ought to have sat waiting in black and white. Instead, his thumb caught on a seam. He turned the book flat under the overhead light, tilted it, and went still. The page wasn't missing the way a page falls out of a book that's been handled too rough for too long, edges soft and rounded from years of thumbing. This edge was straight, close to the spine, straighter than any accident leaves behind, a clean line where paper had been drawn tight and cut rather than torn. "There's a page gone," Purdy said, "right where it'd need to be." Cyrus leaned forward, just enough to see, and studied the seam a moment before he spoke. "That wasn't lost," he said. "Lost pages curl at the edge where they tear. That one was cut clean and close to the stitching. Somebody wanted it gone, and wanted it gone quiet." Purdy looked up at him, and for the first time since the flagpole, he wasn't sure anymore which one of them was actually under suspicion. Word reached the reviewing stand a little after 11 that the ceremony's guest of honor wanted to see the detainee personally before any citation went final, and Rear Admiral Rowan Sedgwick came through the armory's side door in full dress, 74 years old and moving like a man 20 years younger, who had simply decided age was an administrative matter he hadn't gotten around to filing. He stopped 3 steps into the holding room and did not say a word for a long moment. He looked at Cyrus, the way you look at a photograph you'd assumed was lost with the house that burned. "Hobbs," he said. Just the name. Nothing performed in it. "Admiral," Cyrus said, and dipped his chin. No more than that. The provost, trailing behind Sedgwick, cleared his throat and began explaining, in the careful cadence of a man narrating for a record he already imagined being read back to him later, that the detainee had been found bearing an unverified mark consistent with Special Forces tradition, that the intake documentation could not currently confirm the claim, and that per procedure the mark would need to be photographed and the claim formally adjudicated before the Assize. Sedgwick was already unbuttoning his own cuff. He rolled the dress sleeve back past his elbow, and there on his forearm, raised and faded with the same 55 years of sun and skin, sat the same mark, the same forking river shape. The same hand, unmistakably, had cut it. The room did not gasp so much as it seemed to inhale all at once and forget, briefly, to exhale. "This man gave me this," Sedgwick said, loud enough now to reach the gathering crowd pressing close to the doorway, "with a sewing needle and a Zippo lighter, on the bank of a river outside Pleiku in October of 1969, about 40 minutes after he pulled me out of that same river by my collar because I couldn't swim it with a pack on and he could." Nobody in that room moved. "It isn't a unit mark," Sedgwick said. "It was never a unit mark. It's his mark. He put it on every man he pulled out of that water so that if he didn't make it home, somebody would still know who taught them how to cross it." He turned to the provost, and his voice dropped, not softer exactly, but final. "You are not citing this man for fraud. You are looking at the only reason I am alive to stand at this podium today." Cyrus said nothing. He only looked, for the briefest moment, toward the empty shelf down the hall where his name still did not appear anywhere at all, and something in his face, not relief, not yet, something closer to a held breath finally allowed partway out, passed and was gone before anyone thought to name it. The provost, a compact man named Lockhart with a laminated procedure card he consulted the way some men consult scripture, did not uncuff Cyrus even then. "Admiral, I don't doubt a word you've said," Lockhart told him, and to his credit he did seem to mean it. "But the citation is already logged in this morning's incident report. I cannot simply erase a filed report on the strength of a personal recollection, however credible. There's a process for rescission, and it requires documented verification." "Then verify it," Sedgwick said. "With what, sir?" Lockhart turned the ledger around so the Admiral could see the clean-cut seam where the page should have been. The intake record for that exact date and range is missing. Not damaged. Missing. If I rescind a citation on your word alone, and a member of the donor board asks me tomorrow what documentary basis I have nothing to show them but 2 matching tattoos and a torn book. It was meant as caution. It landed in that crowded hallway as something closer to accusation, and a low murmur ran back through the onlookers now pressed 3 deep at the door. Because if the record was gone, then whatever else it meant the museum itself, the very room built to keep faith with men like these, had failed to keep the one page that would have ended this in 30 seconds. Elise Montclair, the Heritage Room's director, arrived just in time to hear that murmur and understand exactly what it implied about her own house. The 1969 ledger has been incomplete for years, she said quickly, too quickly, smoothing a hand down her blazer. Archival loss happens. Paper degrades, boxes get misfiled in storage transfers. We've never claimed the collection was total. That page wasn't lost to time, Purdy said from the doorway, holding the ledger open to the seam for anyone who wanted to look. It was cut. Montclair's mouth opened and then closed again without producing a defense, and somewhere behind her eyes, a 14-year-old decision she had not thought about in some time stirred and did not go back to sleep. Outside, the crowd for the 4 o'clock rededication had already begun filling the folding chairs along the parade ground, unaware that the ceremony they'd come for now sat balanced on a torn page nobody could yet explain, and a Foundation liaison in a gray suit was already checking his watch with the particular anxiety of a man whose grant cycle closed at the end of the day, regardless of how the morning's drama resolved itself. 4 o'clock, Lockhart said, mostly to himself, glancing at the same clock. The standard gets unveiled at 4, whether we've settled this or not, and there's a donor board sitting in the front row who came here to see a museum that keeps good order, not one that loses its own paperwork. Then someone had better find the paperwork, Sedgwick said, and there was nothing dressed up left in his voice at all. Purdy did not sleep that night, and he would tell people afterward, when the story had settled enough to be told, that it wasn't ambition that kept him up, but a plain refusal to be the man who signed his name to a wrong report and let it stand. He started in the archive basement a little after 9, working through supply transfer boxes nobody had opened since they'd been sealed and shelved, looking first for anything bearing Elise Montclair's signature, because a page doesn't cut itself out of a ledger, and somebody, 14 years back or otherwise, had made that decision on purpose. He found the authorization a little past midnight, 3 boxes in, a single memo on museum letterhead dated 14 years earlier. Intake and donor files deemed unverifiable due to budget constraints in the archival program are to be culled from the permanent collection to reduce storage costs. Approved, E. Montclair, Director. Attached to it, a culling log listing dozens of names and dates marked for removal, Cyrus Hobbs's intake range among them, flagged not as fraudulent, but simply as unverifiable, a bureaucratic shrug dressed up as a cost-saving measure. It hadn't been an accusation 14 years ago. It had been a budget line. Somebody had decided that men whose files were incomplete or hard to confirm were cheaper to erase than to properly restore. And nobody at the time had imagined that erasure would someday flag a living man as a fraud at his own ceremony. Purdy sat back on his heels in that basement a long moment, understanding for the first time that the run sheet he'd been enforcing that morning hadn't been wrong by accident. It had been built brick by brick on top of a hole someone else had dug on purpose. He kept digging anyway, past 2 in the morning now, because a memo explained the crime, but not the man, and somewhere in that same building there ought to be a truer record than the one that had been cut away. He found it in a box marked Supply, Medical Equipage, 1969, filed 2 aisles over from where any personnel record would ever have been shelved, because whoever pulled that page 14 years back had gone looking through personnel files and never thought to check supply. Inside, a yellowed carbon copy of an intake and processing log, water-stained at one corner but whole, listing not one name but 42, the medic's log for a single river crossing outside Pliku in October of 1969. 41 names, processed for wounds, exposure, and transport, each one initialed by the same hand. And at the bottom, in that same hand, not flagged as unverified, not listed as a claim requiring confirmation, but recorded plainly, The way a man records a fact about himself, he never expected anyone to doubt. Processing medic. This crossing. Hobbs, C, PFC, attached field aid. He had not come through that river as a man needing to be verified. He had come through it as the one doing the verifying, the one writing down every other man's name before anyone thought to write down his. Purdy carried the carbon up out of that basement at 2:30 in the morning like it might crumble if he breathed on it wrong, and did not stop moving until he'd laid it flat on the provost's desk himself. By mid-morning, the citation had been formally withdrawn, Lockhart's signature beneath the rescission as plain and unadorned as the original charge had been, and word of the carbon had traveled through the heritage room and the ceremony grounds the way true things travel once the fastest liars have already had their say and run out of road. They asked Cyrus to speak. Sedgwick himself asked him, standing beside the podium where the microphone waited, its stand adjusted for a taller man and never readjusted since. "Say what you want to the board," Sedgwick told him, quiet, just between the two of them. "They'll listen to you now. God knows they owe you that much." Cyrus looked at the microphone the way a man looks at a tool that was never built for his hand. "I don't need the microphone," he said. "Never did. You'll stand up with me for the standard at least." "I'll stand," Cyrus said. "I won't talk." So when 4 o'clock came and the honor guard lifted the restored unit standard for the crowd, Cyrus Hobbs stood beside Rear Admiral Rowan Sedgwick and said nothing at all, coat still buttoned to the throat, shoulders still carried low, and turned rather than raised. And the two old men watched the flag catch wind together the way two men watch anything they already understand without needing to discuss it. Afterward, away from the folding chairs and the Foundation liaison already making notes for next year's grant proposal, Cyrus found Purdy standing alone near the empty shelf in the heritage room, staring at the brass placard that still read, "Under review," as though the words might rearrange themselves if he looked long enough. "You did the digging most men wouldn't have," Cyrus told him. "I nearly ended your name over a run sheet," Purdy said. "That's not something to thank me for." "You checked it when it mattered. That's the whole job. Not never being wrong. Checking before you let wrong stand." Purdy nodded slowly, turning that over. "There's a form," Cyrus said, "to get this corrected proper. I want 41 names on that shelf, not mine. They crossed that water same as I did. Longer, some of them, since I got to walk out under my own power, and they didn't all. And your name? Write mine down wherever you write the medic who processed them. That's the truth of it. I don't need it on a plaque to know it happened." He didn't come back for a knife. Purdy understood then, looking at the old man's face in that quiet room. He came back to see if anyone still had his name written down anywhere at all. Not for glory, not even really for himself, but because a man who spends a river pulling other men out of it deserves, at minimum, one line in one ledger somewhere saying he was there. The Heritage Room reopened its intake files to public correction that spring, a small typed notice taped beside the guest book inviting any veteran or family member to submit documentation the old purge might have wrongly discarded, and within 2 months, 41 names went up on a newly cast plaque along the west wall, each one researched and confirmed against the recovered supply carbon, medic annotation included in small clean type beneath the header. Corporal Noah Rutherford rewrote the Gates flag procedure herself that same spring, over 3 long evenings at her own kitchen table, and the new version required 2 independent sources before any name could be marked unverified, rather than one clerk's felt-tip check against an incomplete list. She kept a copy of the old run sheet in her desk drawer afterward, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of exactly how much damage a clean procedure could do when the record underneath it had quietly gone rotten. Elise Montclair resigned from the museum's directorship before the board vote that would have asked her to explain the memo herself, and nobody in Millrace Ford spoke of her with much anger, only the particular disappointment reserved for someone who had chosen a budget line over 41 names and would now have to live with which one history remembered. On Tuesdays, in the kitchen he and Twyla had kept for 56 years, Cyrus still took the leather sheath down from its shelf above the stove and oiled it, thumb over thumb along the seam, though it now carried a small typed card tucked beneath it whenever it traveled to the Heritage Room for its yearly loan. Hobbs, C, Medic's Sheath, River Crossing, I a Drang Tributary, October 1969. His name spelled correctly, finally, in a hand that wasn't his own, but was written to last. "You'll be late again this year," Twyla said, setting 2 cups of coffee down between them, same as always. "Not this year," Cyrus said, and for once it was true. That afternoon, with the sheath returned to its glass case under its freshly typed card, Cyrus sat outside on the tailgate of his truck with Rowan Sedgwick beside him, both men still in earshot of the Heritage Room's open window, saying almost nothing at all, because after 55 years, 2 men who have pulled each other out of the same water have very little left that needs saying. And the sheath behind them, empty now and always, sat exactly at peace with that. Some names get torn out of the record. Tell us below the name of someone who deserved to be written back in.